For this video, we're going to talk about cancer. And the reason we're talking about cancer is that cancer is directly relevant to the other things that we're learning about in class right now. The cell cycle, mitosis, cellular division, all of these cellular processes will end up having an effect or having a cause or being related to cancer in some way. And that's why we're going to start by talking about cancer before we learn about these other processes. Now, at the very basic level, cancer is caused by defects in cell division. And cell division, as you might be able to figure out, is the process by which one cell becomes two cells. So you see we have one cell. It starts turning into two and then ultimately finishes up by becoming two cells. Now, this happens in all living organisms, and it happens in you as well. And it's a process that's important for organisms to create new organisms and for organisms to grow, because one cell can become two cells can become four cells can become 8 cells, etc., etc. Now, a funny joke here for biology is that in biology, division and multiplication are the same thing. That probably doesn't happen in your math class, but for here, cellular division and cellular multiplication are the same idea, right? So when we think of cancer, cancer is where we have too many divisions. So anytime you get a cell that divides more than you want it to, say you only want it to divide 1 into 2, and instead it divides 1 into 2, and then 4, and then 6, over and over, you're going to get cancer. Now, when we have these cells dividing over and over, what we're going to end up with is called a tumor. So a tumor is any place in the body where cells start to divide, and they form into a big clump like this. So you have a nice thin layer of epithelial cells, and in the middle here, the cells have started to pile up on top of one another, and they've created what we call a tumor. Now, you've probably heard the terms benign and malignant to describe tumors. So tumors can be either benign, which means that the tumor is not harmful, it's not doing anything. In essence, it's just a lump of cells that's sitting somewhere in your body. And if you have a benign tumor, oftentimes you'll remove it, but you won't really be worried about other health effects. It's just a mass of cells growing for some reason, not doing anything bad. Now, the opposite end of the spectrum from benign is a malignant tumor. And malignant tumors are the type of tumors that we worry about. Malignant tumors grow very quickly, they're able to invade other tissues of the body, and they're also able to metastasize, which means that they can grow and grow and grow, and then they can split off into other parts of your body and grow and grow and grow there. So as you see in this sad little man, a tumor in the brain, move to the lung, move to the stomach, move to the foot. So once a cancer starts to metastasize and take over the body, that's where you really have severe health effects from tumors and cancer. So as we try to understand cancer, we're going to start with the things that we know about cancer. And one thing that we know, that you all know about cancer, there are certain risk factors for cancer. So when we say risk factor, we mean something that increases the odds of having cancer, but doesn't absolutely result in cancer. So these are things that you could do, or ways that you could live your life that would increase the prevalence of cancer, but might not necessarily cause every single person that does it to have cancer. Now, these risk factors are things that you're probably well aware of. Tobacco is one risk factor. High-fat, low-fiber diet is another risk factor. A lack of exercise is a risk factor for cancer. And related to that, obesity is another risk factor. Excessive alcohol consumption is a risk factor. And finally, increasing age is a risk factor for cancer. And I just want to focus in on 2 of these. One is tobacco use being a risk factor. Now, why is tobacco use a risk factor for cancer? One of those reasons that it's a risk factor is that tobacco contains carcinogens. And carcinogens are chemicals that are known to cause cancer. So by smoking a cigarette or chewing tobacco, you're getting these carcinogens into your body, and these carcinogens are known to cause cancer. And we'll talk in a minute about how they're able to cause cancer. But either way, what you're doing is ingesting or inhaling, otherwise consuming chemicals that are going to result in cancer. And this is a very obvious way of increasing one's risk for cancer, is exposing yourself to any of these carcinogens. Now, the other one on this list that I wanted to focus on was increasing age as a risk factor. And this is one that actually affects everyone. We can't avoid increasing in age. We can't avoid growing older every year. And as you get older, the accumulated effects of living your life on your body create more of a risk of cancer. So you'll find, as you think about people that you may know with cancer, as you look around the world at people with cancer, that cancer occurs more often in people who are older. And that's just because they've had more opportunities for cells to deviate from the normal pattern and for cells to create tumors and become malignant. Now, when we think about these risk factors for cancer, the next question we want to ask is, what actually causes cancer? And the answer to that is going to be simply mutations. So there are a lot of different mutations. It can get really complex when we talk about mutations, but we are just going to talk about mutations in the most general sense. And for us in this class, mutations mean any time we change the gene of something in the cell. So as you remember, a gene is a piece of DNA that encodes for a specific protein. So if you change the gene, you're going to change the protein. Okay, and so what we'll think about is that one cell going into two cells requires many different enzymes. And you remember that enzymes are also proteins, so a mutation will change an enzyme and cause it to not work correctly. So what we're going to think about is that for a cell to divide, it requires a lot of really complex steps. A lot of things need to happen in specific order. And if you change one of those pieces, if you change one of those steps, all of a sudden your cells are going to divide differently and you're going to have cancer. Now, a lot of research has been done. A lot of people are studying each one of the specific enzymes that cause cancer. There are so many different ways to generate cancerous cells. And we're not going to, in this class, get into those different ways that you can cause cancer. Just know for the sake of this class that mutations are what's the base level cause of cancer. Now, two things that mutations can disrupt that are very meaningful to cancer is that cancer can disrupt, in one case, what's known as contact inhibition. So contact inhibition is what keeps cells from continuing to grow when they're touching other cells. So if you think of the skin on your hand, once all the cells fill in, they tend to not grow anymore. The cell is full, right? Everything is filled in, so the cell is touching something on every side. It's not going to grow any longer. However, sometimes these mutations can disrupt this contact inhibition. So even though all of these blue cells are saying we're full, the red cell still divides, continues to grow. As it grows and grows, it's going to form a tumor. All right, so that's one effect that mutations can disrupt. The other thing mutations can disrupt is what's called the anchorage dependence of cells. So if you think about your skin cells as well, or think about cells in your blood vessels, these cells are all anchored onto something. They grow on other cells. They grow on other parts of your body. Sometimes cells can lose that necessity of growing on something. And instead of growing on your skin, they might just be floating through your bloodstream and decide to grow into a big mass of cells. Now, this is a problem because this is what leads to metastasis. Because this cell can now keep dividing and growing even as it's floating through your bloodstream, even as it's moving into organs that it's not supposed to move into. And then you start getting tumors in multiple places of your body because this cell no longer needs to be in its location to grow. It can grow wherever it needs to be. Now, if you get both of these mutations, you're going to have even more of a problem because you're going to have a cell that can go anywhere at once. It doesn't need to be anchored, and it will grow even if it's touching other cells. And this is what's known as the multiple hit model of cancer mutation. And that model basically says that one mutation is usually not enough to cause cancer. You need to accumulate several mutations over a lifetime to get cancer in the body. So one mutation might cause a slight deviation in the cell. However, the cell usually has a backup plan. It's able to, back that up, do something else so that it doesn't divide incessantly. However, if you get a second mutation, you might take out that backup plan. And sometimes cells have a third backup plan. But you can still get another mutation that affects that third backup plan, and then you suddenly have cancer cells growing in the body. And you can see that this is a low-risk event if you consider the probability of hitting one gene and then another gene and then a third gene perhaps to affect the cells in your body. But then think about how many cells are in your body and how many chances you have for this sort of mutation to occur. And then if you add to that some of those risk factors, tobacco smoke, obesity, increasing age, you'll see how the risk of cancer can increase through all of those things. Now, to sort of summarize what we've talked about for cancer today, we basically have three parameters that we're going to think of when we think about cancerous cells. The first thing we're going to think of when we think of cancerous cells is that cancerous cells divide when they should not. So this is the very simplest definition we have of a cancerous cell. You have cells in your body. They divide sometimes. They don't divide sometimes. That's all dependent on whether or not the cells need to divide. But cancerous cells divide whether or not they should or they should not. So you see here, these cells are all dividing, even though the regular cells are sending signals to them saying, do not divide, you should not be dividing. Okay, so that's the first parameter we should think of. The second thing we're going to think of when we think of cancerous cells is that cancerous cells have the ability to invade surrounding tissues. And this is what we see in malignant tumors. So these cancer cells, as they grow, as they divide, they're going to grow into other parts of the cell. And this is what causes tumors and causes cancer cells to move throughout the body, causes all of the negative effects you see from a malignant cancer. And the third thing we're going to think of for cancers is that cancers can move to other parts of the body. And this is what happens when we say that cancer has metastasized. Cancer is able to go from one part of the body to another part of the body. It's able to move itself and then start dividing there as well. So what you thought might have been a brain tumor is now a brain tumor and a lung tumor. And this creates obviously a lot of health problems, a lot of treatment problems when you have someone who has cancer that is metastasized. And the last thing we want to think of when we think about cancerous cells is that all cells that undergo cell division are susceptible to cancer. So by virtue of dividing, you're susceptible to cancer if you lose control of how those cancerous cells are dividing, how any cells in your body are dividing.